When you have a column or a row and you put a child inside like this, you'll notice that an additional property is added to this section right here, expansion. And expansion has three options. The first one is default and it does nothing. That's when there's no expansion. The next two are flexible and expanded. So what are these? Well, when you're laying out widgets in columns or rows, it's easy when they have a fixed width, like 200 pixels. But when you want to fill up like the rest of the space, like this stuff right here, that's what flexible and expanded are designed to do. These are designed to give you two different ways to handle the extra space in your columns and rows. And remember that you'll only see these expansion properties in columns and rows. Okay, so here's how they work. If you just want to fill up the rest of the space, so let me duplicate this right here, change the color. And if I just want to fill up the rest of the space with this orange widget, use expanded. It's the most straightforward and obvious. It just always makes the widget fill the extra space. On the other hand, if you want to make sure that the widget doesn't overflow whenever it becomes larger than this extra space that it has, use flexible. And that's because columns and rows don't automatically handle overflow. So when widgets are larger than the space their parent gives them, they're just going to keep going and then FlutterFlow is going to throw an error. So let me show you this here. So I'm going to put this here. So I'm just going to pull this past the edge of our screen right here so it's bigger and run a test. And we get our overflow error. Now, this isn't a good example for the use of flexible. I just wanted to show you that columns and rows don't automatically handle overflow, and you get this error. We'll look at a practical example in a second. But flexible fixes this by giving your widget a max width of that remaining space, because without flexible, it's just gonna keep going and throw this error like we saw. Okay, so let's look at a practical example. So here we've got a chat UI, and I've got a row with an image and some text. This text right here has no expansion applied to it, which means that if we add more text and it overflows the rest of this space, it's just gonna be cut off and then we're gonna get an error. But if we use flexible, then it's giving this text widget a max width of the rest of this area. So once it hit it, it just wrapped onto the next line, elegantly handling overflow. Now, you could also use expanded. It's going to do a similar thing. The only difference is it's forcing it to fill up the rest of the space. So if I have less text, it's still going to be the full width. And of course, which you pick will depend on your design. All right, let's look at one more example of expanded. So here I've got an onboarding screen, and down at the bottom, I've got a row with two buttons. And this is a very common design pattern. Well, you have two things in here, and you want to tell them, hey, I want both of these children to take up equal amount of space. Then you just both give them expanded. And that looks great. So to say it simply, if you want to force a widget to take up the rest of the space, use expanded. But if you just want to make sure that you don't get overflow errors, that overflows are handled elegantly, use flexible. Okay, so that's the main difference between flexible and expanded. But when you use these, you actually have one additional property that's available to you, and that's this flex value. And what this flex value allows you to do is to tell each child how to split up the space. Okay, so here I've got a row with two containers, and both are set to expanded right now, which means that I have access to the flex property. You only have access to this if you have flexible or expanded set. Now, maybe I want this orange container to take up double the amount of space as this first one. Then I would just give this container a flex value of 1 and this orange container a flex value of 2. Now notice these values are additive. So if you add up all the flex values, so here we have 2 here and 1 here, that's the total. So here that would be the width. So it's as if the width of this row is 3. So then the orange container would take up 2/3 and this purple container would take up 1/3. Now, one thing to note with these flex values is that these are going to work within the constraints of flexible and expanded. So for instance, if in this container I gave it flexible and then added in a text widget, it's going to work just like flexible does. Now it has a max width of 2/3 of this space. If I were to do the same thing in here, there and add this in, notice it does not shrink because this container is expanded. So that is flexible and expanded and flex values in FlutterFlow.